Well, a very warm welcome on behalf of University of Chicago Center in Delhi. The University of Chicago Center in Delhi provides a base for research, teaching, dialogue among scholars from the university across India and around the world. The core program areas of the center are focused on science, energy, medicine, public health, business, economics, policy, culture, society, law, and arts. The center also facilitates the works of two very important institutes in Chicago. One is the Energy Policy Institute. The other is the International Innovation Corps. And many of you are familiar with the center, I know. And one of the things one wanted to kind of remind everyone is that the center is a hot seat for open and academically stimulating and challenging discussion. So living up to our reputation, today we are set out to discuss yet another facet of COVID-19, that is stigma and discrimination during the pandemic. And I welcome your thoughts and participation in the discussion. Well, during the pandemic, we all have witnessed various forms of distress, whether it is lack of healthcare facilities, financial distress, loss of lives and livelihoods, fear, anxiety, and all of that. But it has also exposed us to the worst kind of human behavior, resulting in stigmatizing and discriminating between people on the basis of race, religion, profession, and class. While a large part of this manifested in huge distress, mental distress, but this also led to lack of life-saving opportunities for people. But it's also true that COVID is not the only situation where we witnessed stigma and discrimination impacting lives. There is an unholy nexus between stigma and infectious diseases. We've seen it in the case of HIV, leprosy, social stigma in the case of mental health. Stigma, again, happens to be a well-documented barrier to health-seeking behavior and a major contributor towards health inequities. There are multiple layers to this issue. And today, I'm very happy to say that we have an extraordinary panel of experts who will be helping us explore these dimensions of stigma and discrimination. And it gives me immense pleasure to introduce them to you. We have amongst us Dr. Aniruddha Hazra, fondly called as Anu. Anu is an assistant professor in the section of infectious diseases and global health at the University of Chicago and a director of STI services at the Chicago Center for HIV Elimination. His research centers around sexually transmitted diseases and their impact on sexual and gender minorities, as well as other vulnerable populations. He's passionate about equitable delivery of healthcare to LGBTQ people and people of color. Well, the detailed introduction of Anu, we have very distinguished panelists. I may not be able to do justice to their introduction during this brief time that we have for the webinar. So I would urge you to check the chat box for their detailed introduction. Then we have amongst us our own again, very fondly known as Prabha, Dr. Prabha S. Chandra, the professor of psychiatry at National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences, Bangalore. During COVID-19 pandemic, she was funded by the Ministry of Women and Child Development, Government of India, to start the Stree Manuraksha project, protecting women's mental health, that aims to train counselors and health workers, supporting women facing violence and mental health. Prabha also has written extensively and published and researched in areas of maternal health and women's health in general. Do look up her introduction. Brynel D'Souza is currently the chairperson of Center of Health and Mental Health at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Brynel is the West India coordinator of the Justice Coalition for Religious. She is a co-convener of the Janaswasthya Abhiyan, the government, and has been part of the monitoring committee on health, on action for health with the government of Maharashtra. Her areas of expertise are public health, health rights, marginalization, and health activism. So with this awesome ensemble of panelists, I welcome everyone once again to join in the discussion. We can have the panelists first share some of their thoughts on this issue of stigma and discrimination, and how did it pan out in areas of their work? What did they witness? and then maybe we can have a slightly more informal discussion. So I would request Anu, Professor Anirudh Hazra, to share his opening thoughts on this issue.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Lenny. I'm so happy to be here and be joined by such amazing co-panelists. Like Lenny said, I'm an infectious disease physician here at the University of Chicago, and really the work I do within infections is really around HIV and sexually transmitted infections. And I think, you know, when we talk about stigma and discrimination, what we know is what infections and pandemics do is really expose the fault lines of society. And these fault lines are always there. I think what COVID has done, and speaking from experience, at least in the United States, is really magnify these fault lines across our society, and really showing where resources are truly given to and not. You know, I think when I think about my work in HIV and STIs, that stigma around diagnosis or exposure, or who you were exposed to, what kind of work you do, there are a lot of parallels between that and what's happening now in the COVID-19 pandemic. And with any of these types of pathogens or plagues, it's not being able to eradicate them is often due to the actual stigma that folks experience, either prohibiting them from getting care or trying to access other forms of health. And as COVID is now becoming endemic, and we are using that term endemic more, it's important to look at other endemics across the globe and how stigma and discrimination affects things like the HIV endemics, the TB endemics, and other sort of STIs like syphilis endemics across the globe itself. And so I think these types of experiences or knowledge we have will hopefully inform us as we're entering this new phase of COVID-19.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Anu. Yeah. Thank you so much, Anu. Well, we will pick up issues which you've been kind of dealing with. We can go into those details in the conversation that will follow these opening comments. And now I would request Dr. Prabha S. Chandra to share her thoughts on this issue.
Thank you, Lenny, and thank you, Dr. Hazra, for sort of, highlighting so many similarities between the COVID-19 pandemic and previous conditions which led to stigma and discrimination. And I think just for those who are listening to us, when we talk about stigma, it's about how people see you differently, and discrimination is about how people treat you differently. Many times these two are quite interlinked with each other. Sometimes it can just happen that, sort of either of them happens. But in the COVID-19 situation, I think both were very, very prominent. And I think that the othering was huge in India. The fact that in some ways people who got COVID-19 were to blame because they had been irresponsible. And once they got it, then the kind of public health response as well was quite stigmatizing, with boards on the gate saying this house has COVID and barring those areas. And even some places they were talking about stamping people's hands and things like that, which is an extremely though the idea was to protect others, but I think it can be extremely isolating. So when somebody is facing so much of stigma, it can be a socially isolating experience, and it's very, very hard. And I'll talk a little bit maybe later about the concept of internalized stigma, which really was quite high during COVID-19. So as a mental health professional, I'm not new to stigma and discrimination, because we know that people with mental illness probably face some of the highest forms of stigma and discrimination. But I think in the COVID-19 pandemic, even people who did not have a mental health problem faced so much stigma for the first time. And we saw a range of problems related to that. And like Dr. Hazra mentioned, less help seeking. I knew doctors, very senior doctors, for fear of stigma, did not get a COVID test done. They just got a chest CT done. in case they were worried that they had COVID, to make sure that, their COVID-19 test, RT-PCR doesn't get done anywhere and doesn't get recorded because they would face stigma. So if a doctor, a respiratory physician can face stigma and has so much internalized stigma, you can imagine the man or woman, average man or woman on the street, how much internalized stigma there would have been. So I think, like you mentioned earlier, Lenny, there were issues related to race, there were issues related to religion, there were issues related to gender, and particularly very marginalized and vulnerable populations probably face the sort of, the most problems related to stigma. So those are my opening notes to say that the stigma did not reside only among a certain group. It was sort of widespread, and I personally witnessed a lot of health professional related stigma. And if anybody in the family became COVID positive, the health professional was blamed the first. That she or he was the one who brought in, and there was a lot of anger directed towards that person. So I think these were issues which we were not we were not prepared to face, and it had a huge mental health consequences as a result. So I would like to try to talk a little bit more about some of these in detail as we progress.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Prabha. And yes, there are different dimensions. As I said, the problem has multiple layers, and we may be able to peel them off layer by layer and see what can be done later. Now I would request Brynel D'Souza to share her thoughts on the issue.
So thank you, Lenny and friends. I would like to begin by thanking the University of Chicago Center of Delhi for hosting this important webinar and inviting me to be a panelist. I don't think as health professionals, activists, civil society, and citizens, we've adequately engaged with stigma and discrimination in the context of the pandemic, especially the political basis for it. So I would, so while, in any pandemic, as we've heard before, pandemics, especially those of infectious diseases, have a historical relationship with stigma and prejudice. The bubonic plague, the HIV pandemic, the Middle East respiratory syndrome, or the Ebola outbreak, to name a few, have all been associated with polarization, racism, blame against certain ethnicities or occupations and communities. The COVID-19 pandemic too in India went on to acquire deep political, racist, communal, and casteist overtones. Derogatory nomenclature such as Chinese virus or the Corona jihad soon became part of a disjunctive politics of representation that led to systematic targeting and violence against people from the Northeast, Muslims, migrants, the latter during the first wave, and to some extent, even in the second wave. For example, in Maharashtra, the MNS, or a regional political party, blamed the surge in the second wave to migrants who were returning back. In the initial months of the pandemic, we saw how Corona and coronavirus replaced Chinky in the Indian racist lexicon, revealing not only the ignorant association with China and Mongoloidism, but also the extra charge of disease and infectiousness. There were reports of people from the Northeast being spat on, denied entry into shops, called coronavirus, and expelled from rented apartments. Faced with naked prejudice, university students in some cities chose to return home en masse in fear and panic. And we had our own experience of students from TISS, students and scholars from TISS. Their safety and lives often in jeopardy. As Anirudh has already said, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the fault lines and fissures, not just within the Indian health system, but within society as a whole. The virus soon acquired a race, a religion, and a class. What was clearly emerging was this: the COVID-19 pandemic was far from being the being the great equalizer. And in the case of Muslims, one witnessed prejudice and political factors coming together as key drivers of stigma and discrimination, aided by fake news and videos and biased reporting by certain sections of the media. The country was already in ferment over the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens. Shaheen Bagh and its women protesters were making international headlines. And the February 2020 riots in Delhi had already deepened the sectarian divide, exacerbating religious tensions. And it was in this situation that the Tablighi Jamaat had held its congregation. Okay, and the negligence of a small group of Muslims who came together for a religious congregation, okay, during the last week of February was misconstrued into a conspiracy theory. And we know the kind of marking and targeting that the Muslim community faced all over the country. So I will, basically stop here for now, and we can discuss as we move forward. Yeah.
Thank you, Brynel. And all of you have been able to kind of lay the background, actually set the context for, for us to pick up issues which have been kind of very, very integral, significant to COVID, and see how they panned out. So maybe I would like to start with Dr. Prabha. Prabha, I was thinking that you work with two major vulnerable groups, women and people with mental health illnesses. So I was wondering, and I'm sure most of our participants also would like to know, how did the stigma and discrimination in the case of COVID-19 pan out for these groups who were already vulnerable? There was one read about double jeopardy, triple jeopardy. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts around those, and then maybe we can talk about the other aspects like internalizing stigma and all of that. Yeah. Prabha, I think.
Let me just give you an example, because sometimes I think when we talk in abstract terms, sometimes we're not able to relate to it. I had women who were pregnant and were found COVID positive, who went to have a baby. There were protocols already, which from the American Obstetric and Gynec Society, from the Royal College, including from, I think, the Indian, the FOGSI, that the baby should not be separated. There is no problem related to breastfeeding. But I had mothers whose babies had been separated from them. They had a cesarean section. They were all by themselves in the ward. Nobody could come and help them. She could not feed the baby. Her breasts were engorged. She was not told anything about what is going to happen. I mean, can you just imagine the kind of plight a woman might have faced? And we had women coming with very severe postpartum mental health issues related to an experience like this, which was clearly related to discrimination, because there were protocols already, but some doctors just decided that this was not, they didn't want to follow it. And that's not acceptable. It happened because there was discrimination. So that's one example. We had people in the Bangalore Medical College, the Victoria Hospital, which was one of the largest COVID, hospitals. People jumping from the 3rd floor, 4th floor, ending their lives. Now, why did that happen? It happened because of the internalized stigma that was going on, because they felt that in some way, because of them, their whole family had been stigmatized because they got COVID-19. So, and if you look at the rates of the National Crime Bureau, which have just been released just a few weeks ago, 2020 was the year where the maximum number of suicides have happened in India compared to the last 10 years. And that's really saying something. The fact that people ended their lives, of course, they probably ended their lives because of other reasons, economic reasons being on top. But we really don't know how many of them actually ended their lives due to stigma. And I know that some of the people who are admitted in these large hospitals actually ended their lives because they left notes that they felt extremely stigmatized. So I think that was one group. The other group was people with intellectual disabilities and mental illnesses. When they developed COVID infection, I think that as it is, they were, like you mentioned about double jeopardy, they were already stigmatized, and they had very poor support systems available. The government did start helplines, but then people who are already so disadvantaged probably do not use helplines so much. They don't have internet access. They don't have that kind of money to buy the phone or charge it for data. So I think there were groups which were just completely left behind. in terms of women, I found a lot of women struggling because if your husband or your partner was abusive towards you or was violent towards you and you wanted to go to your paternal home, the fear of COVID kept these women, so they kept the women away saying, I'm not going to allow you to come back. Because, what if you're bringing infection into our house? I've had women actually on the road calling me up and saying, I'm in an auto rickshaw. I've left my husband's home. My mom's home is not taking me back because they're saying, what if you bring COVID to the house and we don't want you? So sometimes it was also about not just people who already had COVID infection, but who were thought to have COVID infection, or who were, feared that, they would bring infection. And there was, again, discrimination and stigma related to that. So I think that a lot of women face that, particularly, I think, women health professionals, much, much more so than male health professionals. And that happened possibly because a lot of the Anganwadi workers and the ASHA workers were involved in collecting data, involved in going to homes, actually being on the field. And they were the ones who got the brunt of it, more than the male health professionals who were probably more in hospitals. So I think there was a huge gender divide in the way COVID impacted. And I'm not even right now talking about the LGBTQI community, because that was another huge area. Particularly the transgender community faced a lot of discrimination during this period as well. So the homeless were another big lot, because they were completely homeless, and they were thought to, because they were homeless and they were living in shelters or below bridges or in railway stations, they were thought to be at bigger carriers. And many of these homeless people were also those who had mental illness. So I think, imagine being homeless during a pandemic. Imagine being mentally ill during a pandemic where, you are more than anything, instead of getting support and warmth and empathy, you are actually getting fear and anger directed towards you. So I think these are the range of issues that happened both for women and those with mental illnesses. Yeah.
Totally agree with you, and very, very unfortunate. On a similar note, Anirudh, I was wondering that from your experience of working with people with HIV-related infection and other infectious diseases, how did you see, was it different in this case, or how did you see the intersection? And what has been your experience in this?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think a lot of the unfortunate examples of stigma and discrimination around HIV was really mirrored in how the COVID-19 pandemic at least impacted us in the United States. I think, like Dr. Chandra mentioned, the fear of getting a COVID test about potentially disclosing your status as being COVID positive, that was very sensitive information that folks either didn't want to share or even personally did not want to know. And so I've had plenty of people who clearly were ill, or patients who were clearly ill, but trying to either not face the illness or not disclose it to others until it became unmanageable at home. And that's when they came into the ER. And oftentimes, like we know with the pathophysiology of COVID-19, there is a point of no return. That there is, after a certain point, even the most heroic medical efforts will fall, silent. And so, the messaging here in the United States was always trying to get your diagnosis early. Like any infection, knowing your diagnosis early is hugely important in its eradication, both within, individual levels as well as population levels. And that level of internalized stigma and just even outward discrimination is seen in HIV, where, we still have less than half the people living with HIV in the United States still do not know their status. And that's out of, their own fear of what that means to them and what that means to their livelihood. Even though, treating HIV in 2021 is much easier than treating pretty much any other chronic illness. It's not the medical aspect of HIV that is the biggest barrier or obstacle for folks accessing or exception care. It's really everything else that goes around with it, all the other baggage, societal baggage that is associated with the HIV diagnosis or an STI diagnosis or a TB diagnosis. All of this, which really impacts how people either engage in care or remain retained in care. And so, yeah, in the United States, I think that stigma and discrimination was quite overt in the first wave and have become less and less overt in the subsequent waves, but still there. It's an ongoing background hum of folks, either joking and saying, oh, this is a cold, don't worry, it's not COVID, as if, any cough or sneeze they do in a public place, they have to preface it by saying that this isn't, something in the pandemic we're living in.
Yeah. So, Anu, I also wanted to understand one more aspect, which actually Prabha touched upon a bit. Many of us mostly sit on the other side of the table and we are advocating, we are engaging with patients and advocating for their rights. You, like Prabha, have been sitting on both sides of the table. You not only treat people, but you also engage with them, particularly people with other health vulnerabilities. You engage with them. You are a rights activist as well. So how did you see, and in fact, most of our advocacy kind of focuses on the doctor, on the healthcare professional and what the healthcare professional should be doing. You've been on both sides of the table. So I wanted to understand, and I'm sure the group also would like to know, how did you see it panning out, being on both sides of the table? Yeah.
I mean, I think it, again, just magnified the inequities experienced by folks, particularly those that are the most marginalized. And so, my patients who had the least amount of resources, who had housing insecurity, food insecurity, relied on sort of unconventional sort of gig economies. Those were the ones that are most impacted. My patients living with HIV who are within these marginalized communities, those are the folks that ran out of HIV medicine, could not come into clinic because either the clinic was closed or not seeing folks. These are the people that we lost during the past 20 months that we're now trying to frantically bring back into care. These are the folks that, kept me up at night trying to know, where are they okay? I treat a lot of folks with substance use disorder, with people who inject drugs. The number of overdoses in the United States nearly doubled that of the previous year due to these financial burdens, stressors, these societal burdens. And like Dr. Chandra mentioned, if you're someone living with mental illness, someone who's unhoused, someone who has, substance use issues, you're already in the margins of society. And so what COVID does what COVID did was push them off the margins and really just off the cliff. And this completely like societal expendability or understanding expendability, that these are the folks, what were they contributing to society anyway? A callousness of human life was really prevalent in the United States, whether that be for elderly folks or for these marginalized folks. If folks felt like, these are the classes of folks that have been impacted with them, are they really that important to us? And that callousness is what I think was most striking to me that came out. And again, it's not that people became callous during the pandemic. I think it exposed people's callousness itself.
Thank you, Anirudh. Well, Brynel, there are several things which one would like to talk about, but let's see how much can be covered in these next 30 minutes or so. Brynel, you've been an advocate of health rights, worked with people with other social vulnerabilities. You've looked at people in Mumbai and the rest of the country whose health rights were violated. And you did see them being exposed to all extreme kinds of discrimination, denial of healthcare. And I'm sure in all of this, human rights were violated, health and human rights were violated in a big way. So I was wondering if you have some thoughts from a human rights perspective.
Yeah, when looking at it from the human rights perspective, as I said earlier, and both Prabha and Anirudh have also said, that illness and illness and stigma, discrimination, there is a close association between that. There is a close association, between caste, gender, sexual identity, religion, ethnicity. and class, in the best of times, okay, that create conditions of vulnerability and risk that affect, for example, access to healthcare and lead to poor health outcomes. With the pandemic, you just see these things getting exacerbated many times over. And there are many reasons for that. I mean, it happens in, as I said earlier, and the previous speakers have also said, it has happened in previous pandemics also. So all the fault lines of society basically get exposed. In the context, and very often, in trying to put together a public health response or strategy for disease control, human rights get compromised, okay, in a big way. And unfortunately, we don't learn from the lessons of the past. So each event happens and we learn our lessons. We've learned a lot in the context of the HIV pandemic. We realize how central human rights is, if you really want to control, and even from a public health standpoint, if you want to control, the pandemic, if you want to control disease, human rights is so important. And yet we saw this being blatantly violated. At multiple levels. So at one level, we saw it, almost, as part of state policy in terms of the kind of messaging that that one was seeing and observed in relation to the Muslim community. We saw it with also with the migrants who were going back. For example, the mass movement of migrants, okay, that was arising out of sheer desperation. We saw how that was being, criminalized, and the returning migrants in Bareilly, UP, was sprayed disinfectants. The chief minister of Telangana, spoke about shoot at sight orders for anyone violating the lockdown. The government of Haryana notified that no arrangement of transport will be made for people to go back to their native homes, and threatened to book for jaywalking and send to temporary jails, those seen as violating, lockdown norms and restrictions. And all of this also reflected a bias against the struggles of poor migrant workers, and blindsiding the enormous humanitarian crisis that one was witnessing. So I would basically say there are three layers to this. Yes, in all pandemics, in very many illnesses, you have stigma and discrimination. In pandemics, and you also see stigma and discrimination getting more acute, human rights violations becoming more, obvious. But what I felt was unique about the COVID pandemic was essentially the state response to the pandemic, where the state was actually, it was not being limited only to individuals and communities and prejudices, but this was all operating in a particular, context, and a particular context of, as I, when I was reflecting, I basically said this, that when pandemics occur in times of hyper-nationalism, anti-minority bias, shrinking democratic spaces, and threats to fundamental rights, the implications for health, well-being, and survival of the community or communities under siege is dire. The implications for disease control and public health is also dire. And the implications for social justice and citizenship rights is also dire.
Yeah, thank you, Brinell. Well, I think we've kind of gone over different aspects of it and seen how particular sections of the society were badly affected, how it panned out in case of again, certain sections of the society, even those who are expected to be aware of it. Say, for example, medical professionals, say, for example, middle class, who are otherwise aware of different aspects of it. I think now, maybe if we could talk and kind of hear your views on what could have been done differently. I'm sure each one of you is positioned, is kind of working with different groups and has a professional engagement with the issue at a different level. So if we could just discuss in the next few minutes as to what could have been done differently. Prabha, if it's okay with you, we can start with you and then.
Sure. Thank you. I was just reflecting when Brynel was talking that when this whole othering started, I was thinking about it a lot and talking to people that this is a time when we should all be coming together actually and supporting each other. And this seems to be the time when we are actually, separating from each other so much. And so what is it? Is it the fear of the unknown that, we don't know something, we don't know what will happen? Is that it? Or is it that, it's something which is infectious and so close proximity will cause it? Because in HIV, the stigma was obviously slightly different. One was, of course, the fear of infection, but also prejudice about how you acquire HIV, about it being, in certain populations and those populations facing stigma anyway. Whereas in the COVID-19 pandemic, that was not the case. It was like anybody could have COVID. So why this much of othering? And I think I just got the answer when Brynel was speaking that it was also the state response. It was also how the whole public health system responded, because we could have focused so much more on awareness, education, not creating these separate, making it so separate. Like they need to be like this and they need to be put away, and these COVID hospitals which are considered a place where you just dump people. And I mean, people were petrified of getting tested because they thought they'll be bundled alone into this ambulance which will take you to this place and they don't know what happens. A lot of it was because there was not enough information, and in fact, if anything, there was more misinformation. So I think many campaigns have shown that good public health information, appropriate, correct information is what is essential. I also think there was, because of the changing narratives, even provided by health professionals on television, on other media, I think the public really didn't trust what was going on. And so when you don't trust your system, then you obviously start doubting everything, and then fear takes over. And once fear takes over, then othering takes over, because then you only bother about yourself. So I think that these were the reasons. And I would say that if you take things back, and then it's important to try to learn from this pandemic. And I fear that we have not documented yet enough about all of this. Why we sort of moved on to second wave and said, oh, second wave, there was not much stigma and it was more about health and blah. But I think that it's very important for, maybe UChicago can do this, that, to try and sort of document some stories and learnings and why, if something like this happens again, what are the things that we can do to prevent it from happening? So I think that's one thing that, comes to mind, that messaging, allaying fears, being very consistent in what you say, trust in the system is something which needs to be focused on much. It was like what happened in Germany, where despite the pandemic being quite severe, there was trust and people believed what the system was telling them. So I think we need to learn from places where, even though the pandemic was bad, there was no stigma. So why was there stigma in some countries and no stigma in some countries? So I think there is a lot of learning, and there's a need for a lot of that kind of documentation that needs to happen.
Great, thank you, Prabha. I know you've seen it in extreme situations in both countries. So what could have we done differently?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, in the United States, I think, we have been undermining our public health infrastructure for, multiple decades now in the US, moving money from public health into other sort of public sectors and whatnot. And I think, when a public health department is sort of depleted like that, it's hard to become proactive. That almost everything we've done in the pandemic was very reactive. And when you're reactive to certain issues or stressors on a regular basis, particularly as information is changing or the infection is changing, it's really hard to have a human rights center's approach on how you develop your response. That when you're constantly just reacting to new information or whatnot without actually having an idea of foresight of what to do in the future, it's hard to think about everyone. And what you're doing reacting is really just focusing on a certain population, which is, what we think is the majority, people with access to resources, and focusing interventions around them. I will say, I feel like when I compare the COVID testing rollout versus the vaccine rollout here in the United States, it's hugely different between the two. That with testing, there was really no organization. It was honestly very difficult to even get a test in the United States for several months, even though a lot of tests were being manufactured within the United States. But I think when folks began to look at vaccinations, the US government actually did create a really impressive group of people who could inform where vaccines go and how to best distribute vaccines in the most equitable way. And using that type of lens, I think, was very different. But going back to Dr. Chandra's note, I think misinformation and disinformation is all wrapped into the politicization of this pandemic. And I think countries that had a higher degree of politicization of the pandemic fared far worse than countries that were able to separate politics from this pandemic itself. And I think, what we're struggling with in the United States is the ongoing the onslaught of misinformation and active disinformation that, all of our citizens are seeing or consuming on a regular basis. And how, a public health infrastructure that still is not where it should be, how can it really combat that? I worry that we're not going to learn from this pandemic, and there will be a next pandemic, whether that's in our lifetime or not. There's going to be another pandemic. And I think the concerns that we have is whether we really learned much from this or not.
Well, that's unfortunate. It's an alarming thing. Yeah. I think before we go on to Brynel, I would urge our participants who are joining this webinar online to pose their questions on the Q&A tab. And before that, if Brynel can also share her thoughts on how we could have.
Yeah. So I think as one reflects back, and one has, some space to reflect back, because many of us were caught, in the intensity of the experience in relief work, and responding to the urgent needs that the pandemic was throwing up. So the pandemic occurred, like I said in my introductory remarks, in a situation of political upheaval and polarization in the country. Okay, we also saw that the Indian government did not act quickly enough, or did not take the pandemic seriously enough. And though the first case was kind of reported in Jan, action really began in March, and a lot of dramatic action and imagery. But there was there was also this attempt to, not really be transparent with information, with data. So one saw a kind of confusion, ambiguity. Okay, and there was also an attempt to downplay the seriousness of the pandemic. So we kept saying, okay, the numbers are not really high, and that is why you said the numbers are not reflecting a national trend. And so what it's really the Tablighi Jamaat that is responsible and has carried the infection. But that at that point in time, we didn't even have adequate testing to be done, that was happening. The private sector was just roped in. The tests themselves were so expensive. So to make those kinds of remarks were deeply problematic. So on that front, and then as the government began to see that the cases were increasing, there was a kind of a knee-jerk reaction. And the knee-jerk reaction, led to some very extreme response in terms of the lockdown. I think India has had perhaps one of the most extreme and restrictive lockdown periods, and many of the actions that Prabha has said earlier, labeling people, putting banners outside people's homes, identifying street corners as COVID, as places where people with COVID infection, or some of the earlier remarks that I said, seeing the migrant exodus as something which was violative of lockdown restrictions and not a response to a humanitarian crisis. All of that contributed to the way stigma and discrimination and unfolded. I always say, and again I'm going back to what I said earlier, we respond to stigma and discrimination when stigma and discrimination occurs. Our public health strategies and programs or responses don't have an inbuilt mechanism. So it's about infection control, but it is not about looking at the entire pandemic or the situation in whole. So we could have had, a proper, we may not have understood the scale of, of the disruption and the fear and whatever, but managing stigma and discrimination should have been an integral part of the government's response. Okay, and you can't have a government on one hand that says do not stigmatize, do not discriminate, but in its overall policy, obliquely or obviously discriminates or marks or targets a particular community, because those dynamics are going to carry out in, even in a pandemic. Public health and larger, politics cannot be separated.
Yeah, thank you, Brinell. Thank you, Prabha, Anirudh, and Brinell. I think this was a wonderful dissection of the issue and different aspects of being of stigma and discrimination being discussed at this length from a varied lens. I think that was great. So now I'll do what I'll do is that I'll take some questions which have been sent to me, and I think this particular question must be from someone from the university fraternity, and I will let any one of you pick up the question. And I think we are very, very nicely gravitating towards the next step as to we've witnessed what the worst of humankind and the health infrastructure, health system could actually, manage. So going forward, what are the different things that one can do? I heard that Prabha mentioned about messaging, Brinell mentioned about the role of the health system. Anirudh, maybe this is for you. Someone wants to know from a research perspective, what are the different areas on which we need to understand stigma and discrimination in pandemic situations better? What are the areas where we need to delve deeper with an academic lens and see what can be done on this issue?
Yeah, I think that even before that, we have to make sure there's funding for this type of research. I think that's almost equally important than the people doing the research, making sure that you're lobbying your governments to make sure that they're funding this type of research, funding health equity research. And I think that's really what this is. This is health equity research. What we, in the United States for the longest time, academics considered to be a soft science that maybe did not really impact or whatnot. But health equity research is the whole understanding of social determinants and how these are obstacles or barriers into having care. And this is not just for COVID, this is for heart disease, this is for diabetes, this is for everything, not just a pandemic situation. And so I think putting more effort into understanding what are the true factors contributing to health inequities across the population, and what are specific inequities or specific stressors that are causing this, and how do you adapt to that, or how do you actually address them? I think in the United States, for us, it's the largest social determinants are all centered on accessing care. If folks aren't able to, get to appointments, pay for medicines, et cetera, what is their safety net? How can we ensure that they remain engaged in care? So, there is now a huge push to understand what are certain solutions that we can make to make sure folks are able to, come into care or remain sort of engaged or retained in care. The other aspect of this is actually understanding how pandemics evolve and where pandemics actually come from. And so truly going back to emerging infectious diseases, and this is just, the field that a lot of my colleagues work in is funding that type of work, funding, these sort of outbreak investigations, really trying to go back to funding public health work that can identify outbreaks early, put them under control before they spread to other communities and become a pandemic again. But before all of this, it's having to make sure that governments prioritize this type of research and this type of work with actual dollars and not just slogans or their own sort of speeches.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I think a lot of food for thought for the university. Again, going with the flow, I would request Prabha to kind of help us think through this particular issue. What one understands is that a lot of scholarship around stigma and discrimination actually originates from work on mental health issues. Social stigma, obviously, one saw in case of mental health in a big way. And there have been a lot of learnings from the mental health discipline and has influenced further work on stigma and discrimination. Being a mental health specialist, do you see there are certain areas of intersection which need to be studied more, which needs more academic dwelling?
Absolutely. You know, one of the things that struck me during the pandemic, that all the task forces that were created by the government and various state governments, etc., had very less representation from different communities.
Mental health.
So yeah, so we didn't really. First of all, we had a sort of a notional kind of a task force on mental health which was not really functional, which didn't bring out any recommendations. In fact, they should have had a very major role to play. Okay, you know, when a pandemic is new, sometimes you don't know and you're just struggling, but even within a few months, we realized that mental health was a huge issue. So there was a creation of a task force, but I did not see anything which came out of the task force out in the public domain about what recommendations that made and whether they were being taken seriously or is it just a tick box kind of a task force. The second thing is representations in task force. Most of the task forces were men, doctors, and sort of there was no representation of women, of users, of people with disabilities, intersectionality. So then how do you know what a woman ASHA worker is facing when you don't have representation in the group which is making those decisions? So I would think that, you know, with universities, you having policy sort of initiatives, we really need to think about who should be there in some of these decision-making bodies and what methods should they use to listen to the voices of what is happening to people who really need them. So if you want to have equity, then you should have equity from top down, like it should be there. And I always felt that it was a very top-down kind of an approach, whereas it should have actually emerged from the communities about what they need, and the task forces should have listened to what was happening rather than having these little meetings and just deciding something, what they felt. So it was very disappointing, to see inadequate representation. So I would think that to me, how do you influence policymakers to understand the importance of representation? How do you make policymakers understand the value of representation and that the fact that they should ensure that everybody's voices are heard and that they are not, you can't sit on your desk and make decisions for the whole world or the whole country. You really need to be out there. So I think to me that would be it's not a research question, but it is a question that all of us who have some say in matters need to think about and put it down as a recommendation. That, going forward, any task force that you have, any policy making group that you have should have active, enough representation, and it should be a bottoms up approach rather than a top down approach.
Thank you. I think that was great. Brinell, coming to you, civil society organizations have been at the helm of affairs when we saw COVID, both providing healthcare, relief, mental health support, all kinds of livelihood support, several things. So what is it that you think civil society organizations could have done differently or can do going forward?
Yeah. So civil society basically stepped in because you could see a government paralysis. Governments were largely focusing, and even when they were largely acting from a very from a public health standpoint, so in terms of, lockdowns, restrictions, managing testing, setting up, augmenting services in relation to healthcare and things like that. So civil society stepped in a big way in terms of relief. I think that was a very, very critical area of civil society support, and I have some concerns also about that, which I'll come to shortly. So civil society definitely looked into relief, and in some ways also facilitated access to care. I mean that happened in the first wave, but that one saw it, many times over in the second wave, when you saw that the shortage of beds and oxygen and everything. It was basically civil society, ordinary citizens that came forward, like what Prabha has, what Prabha has already mentioned. But civil society was not really in decision making. They were not really in policy formulation. The policy formulation was happening by, a group of male doctors, to put it very simply, and many of them were also not public health professionals. I mean, so forget, they were clinicians, and you even, public health expertise was also quite limited. And we in Bombay, actually through JSA, had tried so much to get the nurses involved in the task force, but they kept saying that this is about clinical protocol, so they would say this is not, but as if nurses do not have a say. I said, okay, you at least begin with nurses, and had government actually used civil society well, you would have had a more humane response to the crisis. And in Dharavi, for example, when they could not manage the infections, they realized that the only way they could do it was through civil society partnership with community-based organizations. And then that was touted as, as the Dharavi model. And so the other problem about, with civil society was that you found two kinds of civil society engagement. So you found those, historically working on issues of land rights, housing with the urban poor. And so they responded, and their attempts were also to ensure, state accountability and not to take over the state response, but to complement it. On the other hand, you had other civil society organizations, mainly coming from corporate backgrounds and, set up during the pandemic. And unfortunately, they took over the role of the state. There was not much effort at advocacy or to see how the state can take ownership for processes. As a result, there was a lot of dependency from the state. So the state then began to look at civil society. Take for example, for ration kits. So we understand in the first month or second month, you don't have your act together. But it was very interesting that in the second wave, as soon as the second wave and the surges, you saw surges in cases, the lockdown was imposed. I had a BMC official call me up and said, can you help with ration relief? And I said, how is the state getting dependent on civil society? So and we have also given them that impression that we are able to raise the resources. Now, what happens in this kind of a discourse or narrative? Relief, the right to food, the right to healthcare is the state's mandate. We cannot, we can complement, we can support, but at no point in time should we take over that mandate. Because then, people, a lot of this is not even sustainable, because in the second round, wave, many civil society organizations could not respond with, relief, because they simply didn't have the resources anymore. So they are not sustainable. Besides, these are entitlements that people should have as citizens. And therefore the state has a responsibility to fulfill that mandate.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I was feeling so bad that we are almost at 6, almost at the end of the time that we had kind of dedicated for this. And a topic like this, I'm sure we can have 2 long days of discussion, and there are so many strands to this issue, and one needs to put in that much time to do justice to each aspect of it. But before closing, I would like to thank all our panelists. It's been great. I know that we've been talking informally and formally about different aspects of this, and from the university perspective, I go back with a lot of food for thought in terms of what are the new areas of research, what are the new areas for policy engagement, what are the new areas for community engagement, with a vision, with a special reference to groups which are vulnerable, need additional support. How does one customize best practices, knowledge, what should I say, capsules which have worked elsewhere, and try and bring it to contexts like this. So there are a lot of these areas, and I must say that this is just a beginning of that discussion. We would like to continue engaging with you, have more detailed discussions, find out ways in which we could work together, and try and forge these collaborations to take forward the university's mission of doing more scholarly research in each of these areas. Public health of people with health vulnerabilities is a major area of the university's work, and stemming from it, policy engagement. So all of you, I wanted to thank and reinforce that we will stay committed to this issue. We will knock at your doors again to borrow your expertise and explore avenues for working together. So thank you, a big thank you to all our panelists, big thank you to the participants, my colleagues at the University of Chicago Center in Delhi, without whom it wouldn't have been possible to do this discussion. For the rest of the others, I wanted to mention that the center is the hot seat of action. So do look out for discussions like this coming every week. And yes, I with a big thank you and a great evening ahead and a great morning for Anirudh. I look forward to meeting all of you in our forthcoming discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.